And now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite on stage the moderator, the managing director for Bankable Frontiers Associates, David Porteous, and he will be accompanied by the distinguished speakers, Tan Sri Dr. Zeti Akhtar, Governor Bank Negara Malaysia, Jean-Baptiste Campoir, the Vice Governor for the Banque Centrale des États de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, BCAO, Senegal, and also Dr. Jose Luis Negrin Munoz, Director of Financial Service Evaluation, Banco de Mexico, and also the Tilman Elbeck, the CEO of the CGAP, and Dr. Atiur Rahman, Governor of the Central Bank of Bangladesh. Please give them a round of applause on stage.
Zeti. Good morning, Governor Zeti, please. Good morning. Come over. Please have a seat. Your Majesty, distinguished guests, good morning. From us, the members of this panel, who have the opportunity to build on what we've heard in the opening remarks this morning, and to go to the next level of asking this question of how do we optimize impact of policies, and how do we synergize the linkages between the different objectives which we've heard about. Those words, optimize and synergize, we've heard in different ways already this morning, and we know that they are big words, easy to say, but hard to do. And so I'm delighted that this morning I'm joined here by a distinguished panel that consists of 4 central banks from different parts of the world. From Malaysia, Governor Zeti, whom you've already heard from this morning, our host, co-host here at the Global Policy Forum. Governor Rahman from Bangladesh Bank, Vice Governor Compaore from BCAO, Bank of the West African States, and then Jose Luis Negrin from Banxico, the Central Bank of Mexico. 4 different central banks who have had to wrestle through thinking about what do these words mean in practice. And we're joined by someone who is then not a central banker, but who comes from an organization that's occupied, in many ways, a central position in helping start to think through this question of linkages, and that's Tilman Elbeck, the CEO of CGAP. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for helping us as we start to think through the next level of the messages this morning. Now, as we've already heard, the question of these linkages is not a new one. Linkages between different policy objectives is something which central bankers and other policymakers have wrestled with since time immemorial. But what we've heard this morning is part of what's new is introducing the issue of inclusion as an additional linkage to be considered, which, as Governor Zeti reminded us, brings risks that have to be managed, as well as opportunities, as we've heard this morning. And so this morning we want to start thinking beyond framing simply the linkages into this question of how does one think about synergizing going forward. So as we frame the panel this morning, I'd like to put before you 2 pictures, because our discussion this morning builds on previous discussions that started last year in the GPFI, in Cape Town, in fact, linked to last year's Global Policy Forum, at which there was an explicit discussion around this question. So if we may, could we put up the first picture that we have, simply to help frame this question of seeing inclusion, stability, integrity, and consumer protection, but as Her Majesty's reminded us this morning, seeing it in context as well. So those 4 core objectives that we've already heard about this morning, inclusion, stability, integrity, and protection, don't exist in isolation, but they exist in the context of much wider objectives. They don't exist for their own sake. They exist in order to link to the broader objectives which exist in any society. So I don't yet see those up on the screen? Now I do. So in many ways, just a simple picture to capture what we've already been hearing this morning, which is those so-called ISIP, that acronym that stands for those 4 common objectives, which we've already heard this morning framed as being complementary and overlapping. In many ways, it's easy to frame those as complementary in the long run because we all know that in practice, dealing with the policies to achieve those objectives may not be so easy. And so the linkages among those policies are what we're grappling with this morning. And even though our focus here is about ISIP, which is the core part of the agenda of financial policymakers and regulators, as we were reminded this morning by Her Majesty, those 4 objectives exist in this broader context of societal objectives such as equality, such as growth. As Alfred Hannig reminded us, quality growth, not only growth this morning, national security, urbanization. Those are factors that in some ways lurk at the corners of our thinking sometimes as financial policymakers, but cannot be excluded even as we focus on the core of the ISIP objectives this morning. So as we discuss linkages, what do we mean? Well, here's a very simple picture, if you like, a simple 2x2 depiction of different linkage zones. Now, in 2 dimensions, you can't show all 4 of those ISIP objectives, so let's simply show 2, inclusion and stability, for example, which is part of at least the mandate of the central banks on the stage here. It's possible to say, in terms of each of those objectives, one could conceive a policy that has a negative impact, possibly a neutral impact on that objective, maybe a positive impact. And if you combine those 2 dimensions, you can see a variety of different zones. So when we talk about synergy here this morning, in some ways we're grasping after what is in that top right-hand corner, the green zone of synergy, where there's a positive outcome on at least 2, if not more, of those 4 objectives. Of course, you might have no outcome on anything. That's called an ineffective policy. And then indeed there are the red areas, the trade-off zones, and a variety in between of places where you might achieve one objective but fail on the other, also trade-off zones. So in our discussion this morning, in some ways we're asking, what are the policies which might, for example, at least promote inclusion without a stability trade-off? Can we go beyond that to looking at policies which in fact are mutually reinforcing, as we heard this morning, that can achieve both objectives? However, we know, and some of the early work that was done in that GPFI paper, which CGAP and DFID prepared last year, gave examples from South Africa in which, with good intention, policies that might have started seeking to achieve one without compromising the other can still end up in a lose-lose situation. That can happen in the real world in which we all live today. So the question we're faced by is, with those core set as our core objectives, how can we do a better job of, if you like, navigating into the green areas and wherever possible, avoiding the red areas? That's a very simple way of putting what, of course, is this morning, I hope, a very rich discussion and one that helps build on what we've already heard. So in order to start that discussion, it's important, I think, for us to have a sense of, among the central banks that we have here, what are their objectives in respect of ISIP? Whether all of them, inclusion, stability, integrity, and protection, some of them, formal or not. So maybe, Governor Zeti, I could ask you first as our host to give us a sense from Bank Negara's perspective, those 4 ISIP objectives, which of those are part of your formal mandate at Bank Negara today?
Well, actually, all of them are part of our mandate. And in 2009, we had drafted a new legislation for our central bank, the Central Bank Act of 2009. And in there, we I think we were one of the first central banks to actually legislate financial stability, and we defined it as with greatest clarity that we could of what it meant. Then we also legislated financial inclusion, which was very important because we stated in the Act that one of our mandates was to develop a progressive and inclusive financial system. So I think that, and aside from the other two of integrity, we have an anti-money laundering legislation on its own, and so on. So we believe it's through legislation and then through having dedicated resources within the bank, either with a department or staff and so on. And the third one is having goals and targets and outcomes so that the whole organization can be aligned to that outcome. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't mean if one department is doing the work of financial inclusion and another on financial stability, but to have the entire organization look to how they can contribute to each goal.
Right.
And certainly financial inclusion is one of them.
So it's a mandated objective, and you think having it legislated is a helpful part of entrenching that for you.
Yes.
So we're going to talk a lot more about how one can do that and Bank Negara and your thinking. Let me ask Governor Raman, though. So Bangladesh Bank, are you in the same position with these 4 objectives mandated for you as the central bank?
We don't have actually the open legislation like that, but the core mandate of the central bank, the Bangladesh Bank, which is called Bangladesh Bank Order, that gives me enough kind of space to really act on each of them. The Act says that not only that you'll have to work for the stability of the currency, in addition you'll have to work for the productive sector so that they enhance growth. But again, the third element is that whatever you do for the public interest. The moment you bring in the public interest, you can then start doing anything which is helpful for all the population, particularly for the disadvantaged. And as you know, Bangladesh has been a social laboratory for financial inclusion, not only in terms of the largest financial microfinance network which we have developed, thanks to some of the pioneering stalwarts like Professor Yunus or Fazlul Hassan Abed and others, but also the central bank has been at the steering in terms of having the legislation for microfinance regulatory authority, where the governor happens to be the chairman of the microfinance regulatory authority board. So through that microfinance, we have steered the financial inclusion. But in addition, the central bank itself has developed a financial inclusion strategy. This is our strategic goal. In our one of the major goals of the central bank, we not only have separate departments for financial inclusion, financial stability, but again, as Dr. Jetty was telling, this is our core mandate now, and it reflects through all our activities. Just let me give you one example that will say how we central bank really care for financial inclusion.
Well, Governor, may we come back then just 1 moment? I'll tell you why. I'd like to just get the mandate question clear, and we're going to come right to that in a moment.
Okay.
Because what we're hearing is we have a mandated set of objectives, and then in your case, you have a broad enabling mandate that enables you to build on that. I'm wondering, because the Central Bank of Mexico, Dr. Negrin, is in a slightly different position, perhaps. Can you tell us, you have 2 regulators. You're not the prudential regulator, as is the case in your colleagues here. How does the ISIP objective fit into your framework?
Well, we do have a priority on stability. Our mandate is basically stability, although it also includes the efficient, having an efficient payment system, and it also includes having a healthy financial system, whatever that means. So we there kind of can include certain things about financial inclusion. So if we move from our act, from our law, in other laws, we've been given other responsibilities that have a lot to do with financial inclusion. In particular, there is a Transparency Act that gives us some power for example, transparency, providing information to the customers of how much they're charging, being able to compare between charges of different institutions. And even more recently, we are part of a National Council of Financial Inclusion. So even though we don't have financial inclusion explicitly in our law, through different ways, we are getting more involved in financial inclusion.
So all these objectives feature for you in different ways, but they still come to the fore, even though stability is your core mandate as the regulator.
That's correct. That's correct. So I guess the main mandate is stability, and then we are extending our influence to other areas. You know, I was telling you before that central banks tend to have this reputation of doing their work well. And then the legislators have given us more and more power in other areas that weren't originally the plan of the central bank.
We like your image, clearly the audience does too, of the healthy financial system, and defining that in some ways as one in which all those objectives coexist in a mutual way. But let's hear from BCR. So, Vice Governor Compaore, those ISIP objectives, how do they sit in the mandate of BCR? And I understand you will speak to us in French.
Oui, je préfère. Merci, Monsieur le modérateur. Je voudrais, en prenant sur mon temps de parole, vous demander de me permettre de m'acquitter d'une mission, une mission de représentation du gouverneur Koné, qui aurait voulu être avec vous, qui malheureusement n'a pas pu le faire. Mais il m'a demandé, il m'a chargé de saluer tous ses amis de l'Alliance, de remercier les autorités qui nous assistent ce matin et bien entendu de remercier son homologue de la Banque centrale de Malaisie et toute l'équipe ici et tous les amis pour leur accueil. Alors cela dit, c'est vrai qu'au niveau de la Banque centrale des États de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, nous avons fait une réforme récemment qui nous amène à nous intéresser plus aux pauvres, puisque nous avons une localisation qui se trouve être au sud du Sahara. Nous avons donc des pays fortement appauvris. Et donc nos objectifs tiennent compte un peu de cela dans la nouvelle réforme. Nous avons un objectif qui est la stabilité des prix. Mais la réforme nous dit que sans préjudice de cette stabilité des prix, nous pouvons intervenir pour aider les pays dans le sens de la croissance et du développement. Ce qui nous amène à avoir des possibilités d'intervention pour aller au-delà de la croissance, au-delà de la stabilité des prix, pour nous intéresser à ce qui est de la répartition et des moyens qu'on peut donner aux plus pauvres pour accéder à un meilleur niveau de vie. Je dois dire que cette possibilité a été saisie par la Banque centrale pour notamment s'orienter dans le sens du développement de la microfinance, qui est déjà une ouverture vers les pauvres, mais ce qui est particulier avec la FI, c'est que nous nous intéressons encore à la frange des plus pauvres des plus pauvres. En élargissant cela, nous sommes confrontés à d'autres de nouveaux défis qui se posent à nous, à savoir comment aller jusqu'à gérer ces plus pauvres des plus pauvres, leur donner de meilleures possibilités d'accès aux services financiers à large échelle, tout en préservant une certaine stabilité, parce que c'est important que le système soit crédible, qu'il puisse être permanent et qu'il puisse être d'une durabilité qui permette de voir le long terme venir. Merci.
Thank you, Vice Governor. So let's see whether what we're hearing on the stage here corresponds to your experience. In other words, from these four central banks, we're hearing that those four objectives all feature, but they feature in different ways. Mandated in the case of Bank Negara, a general mandate interpreted in the case of Bangladesh, and we've heard the more traditional view of certain central banks as stability enforcers, but now having to consider inclusion as a factor in the nature and pattern of their growth. So I'd like to ask if we can put up the first voting question this morning. It's a question that asks you, in your country, so if you're from an AFI partner and you're not based in a country yourself, please think of the country you're in. But it asks about your mandate. So the question is, in your country, is financial inclusion a mandated objective on the same level as the others? So you heard Bank Negara, for example. Is it a mandated objective, but perhaps secondary to other objectives for the regulators, such as stability, maybe? Maybe it's not mandated in law as such. Or perhaps it's not even yet recognized as an objective. And just maybe there's a 5, there's another category out there. So please, using the voting panel that you tried earlier, give us a sense of where you all stand before we then launch into the discussion, which we're so keen to do here, about how do you do this in practice, because it's not easy. The orange button, I understand. First the orange button and then the voting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Thank you, Governor. It's a very natty system in the chair. You have until the music fades, I understand. So it's elevator music while we wait.
Banning itself.
Yes. Well, this one shouldn't be that hard. We might have some harder ones coming up where you might need the music to think about them. This is meant to be the easy starting question before the hard questions about optimizing. So let's see what that looks like, and then let's start talking about how we think about doing that. Okay, so on the screen behind us, unfortunately for the panelists, you won't see it in front of you. It looks as if the majority of people in this room today are in countries where inclusion may not yet be legislated as an objective, but it's recognized as important alongside the other ones. But it's interesting, Governor, a number of people in the same category as you are there, Category 1, and a whole big group in Category 2, where it is recognized, but not quite necessarily for the regulator at the same level as the others. So we're a room full of people, very few others, by the way, and only 15 not recognized. Alfred would like to see you afterwards to talk about that. But it looks like we're in a room full of people who all are wrestling with the very live issue of how do you do this? Now, I remember hearing several years ago a management guru, Michael Porter from Harvard Business School, talk about a chief executive as the guardian of trade-offs. Now, of course, as governors of central banks, you're chief executives, but you're also policymakers, and you're also, in a sense, guardians of trade-offs. But the question for us today is that what it really is? Is it trade-offs, or is that green zone possible? So maybe, Governor Zeddy, I could start with you again, because your speech, you referred to this middle ground concept where you spoke about those objectives coming together. So for you, does that middle ground concept include synergy between the objectives?
Well, first of all, there has to be clarity on the outcome that we want to achieve. That's why always our starting point has to be, what is it, the outcome that we want to achieve? And then look at what is the purpose of this outcome, therefore the ultimate goal. And the ultimate goal, I think, as Queen Maxima has very articulately highlighted, is that we want growth and equity. This is the final outcome. Our policies are just a means to an end. Financial inclusion is a means to an end. Financial stability is a means to an end. And that is a common end that we want to achieve, that is growth with equity. And financial inclusion certainly allows us to achieve this. And we also want it to be achieved in a sustainable manner. We just don't want it to be achieved for now. We want it continuously going forward into the future for even the future generation, our children. Therefore, this clarity in outcomes, and when we talk about financial stability, well, how we have defined it is first that financial intermediation function continues to operate. It is not disrupted by instability. Second, the financial markets also function. And third, there's confidence in the financial system. And these are priorities that must be achieved. And having financial inclusion there will reinforce this outcome, because if you don't have financial inclusion, you will not have balanced growth. If you do not have balanced growth, you will not be sustainable going forward into the future. So the first element is that it must, every segment, including outside the central bank, must understand these goals. And for us, of course, financial inclusion is not achieved just by the central bank. And we need to work with the Ministry of Finance and the other ministries and so on. And therefore, there needs to be important in this, and from the experience that I've had, the education process with all these other agencies so that we know what our common goal is and we can manage these trade-offs. There will be trade-offs because if you want financial stability, you might have regulations that will have consequences on financial exclusion, for example. And certainly we know that from the political leadership, they of course want the charges by the banks, either for the financial services or for access to financing, to be as low as possible. But if it is too low, then we all know that it's not going to be a sustainable scheme or program. And so all these can be achieved through understanding. I always believe that this communication flow is very, very important. And this communication flow has to be always, because if the communication flow is only when you need their support or when there's a crisis, then it will be challenging. They're not going to understand you very well. But if you continuously have that communication flow, then there is that understanding. So when you want their support on an issue, there's a greater probability that you might get it. And during a crisis, then even more so. So these are some of the strategies that can lead to managing the trade-offs.
So we hear you use the word, Governor, that Her Royal Highness used as well, this reinforcing, mutually reinforcing linkages, but you remind us that trade-offs exist too. That's the world of real policy making, and dealing with both then is a challenge. So let me ask Governor Raman, you used a similar word recently in a publication. You used the word mutually supportive on these linkages. So Governor Raman, are you confident that that's always the case? Or are there trade-offs as well that you are concerned about?
Thank you. I mean, many of you may have come across these small booklets which I have distributed, which says the mutually supportive relationship between financial inclusion and financial stability. This is also in our website, so you may have look at this. The arguments which we have built in this, it's a actually win-win situation. It's really, when you go for financial inclusion, finally, you really go for financial stability. And we argue that the financial inclusion not only supports the financial sector, but it also supports the real sector. So that's a reinforcing kind of thing. Say, in financial sector, the inclusions, really leads you to diversifying your asset bases. You go for, much more diversified asset base. So you have a very stable kind of liquidity base, the funding base. Secondly, inclusion also leads you to small deposits. The larger ones can run away in any minute, but this you have a larger kind of deposit base, and which gives you a lot of stability. Again, on the other side, when you lend, actually you are giving to different segments of the populations, and again they are the ones who will not run out. They will not hear the rumors that something has gone into a bank. So the larger ones always migrate, but the smaller ones stay put. So that gives you a strength that the financial sector really comes. And they are the ones, if you can bring them into formal sector, they are the ones who will not go into the pyramid sector, the pyramid schemes. They will stay with you. Let me give you an example which I could not give you last time. The tenant farmers. These are the farmers. These are the wretched of the earth. These are the people never get any kind of financial support because they don't have collaterals. They don't have land. But again, they can be accessed through financial inclusion. What we did in Bangladesh Bank, we directly refinanced one of the largest NGOs or the MFIs of the world called BRAC. We have given them about 500 crore, which is about $500,000 taka to the BRAC, so that they could raise 500,000 of the tenant farmers directly. The central bank providing the refinance directly to an MFI without even going through a bank, so that the farmers who never get money, they have an access to it. And 50% of those farmers are women. These are the people who got the money for the first time in their lifetime. And that has given an agricultural kind of boost. Bangladesh today doesn't have to import a gram of rice. Look at this. This is a macroeconomy. Because if we had to import $1 billion of rice, we would have lost $1 billion from my reserve. But the reserve has already gone up 3 times over the last four years, just because of this kind of innovative stand we took it.
Reinforced.
Reinforced. In fact, we even have motivated the foreign banks like the HSBC, Standard Chartered banks, to get into agricultural credit through the MFIs, the microfinance, the regulated microfinance, where I'm the regulator again. So about all these banks are supposed to give 2.5% of their outlays to the agriculture through these MFIs. If they fail, I only ask them to, the amount they fail, the target, I only ask them to put the money in my reserve, in Bangladesh Bank. We're at a very low rate of interest, at 3% rate of interest. So next year, they overperform and get back the money at 5%. So that's how I have put in even the foreign banks into agriculture. And Bangladesh, at the moment, is agriculturally self-sufficient, just in 5 years. Just because of the innovative moves we have taken, and the government has also moved. We have given about 13 million bank accounts to the farmers. All the farmers in Bangladesh has got a 10 cents bank accounts called no-frill bank accounts, and all the subsidies, all the agricultural loans go through those bank accounts, and these bank accounts give them a handle, so there is a transparent. No middleman can take away their money. So that's how we are bringing in also the integrity into the picture. So financial inclusion really leads you to not only this stability, also give you legitimacy, because people think that the banks are only for the rich people, but if once you go for the financial inclusion, it spreads and gives you the political legitimacy that the banks do care for humanity, cares for the downtrodden, and that's how you bring in a wider kind of dimension. We had gone for a road show from one part of the world, from the country to the other part, with all my CEOs and the governor walking along to bring into the notice that this is financial inclusion is good for the stability and the economy. And also, we included in that anti-money laundering, small SME financing, and women entrepreneurship, all together packaged. And the whole country was in that roadshow for about 7 days. All media were covering So this has brought into the message to every nook and corner that financial inclusion really leads to a financial growth. And that's why Bangladesh could manage 6+ growth over the last 5-6 years. There was no less than 6%. And the inequality, there was no increase in Gini coefficient. The rural consumption Gini is still 0.33, and it's a stable kind of economy. There is no financial problem in Bangladesh, and the real economy has also been really benefiting from this synergy of the financial inclusion and stability.
Well, Governor, thank you. So that's a great example of a policy, particular choice, or actually a set of choices where you've seen, you believe, these reinforcing linkages. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to ask Tilman Ubik at this stage. So from CGAP's perspective, looking across countries, Tilman, do you see synergies, trade-offs, both, and what makes the difference for you in these objectives?
So we are far away from collectively having a very rich and conclusive evidence base. But we are building it together. Governor is writing himself, which I think is great. And what comes out of what we know so far shouldn't surprise you, I think. There are clear positive synergies, linkages that you would expect. So, for example, and it's easier to think about this pairwise. So stability is obviously required for people to want to be included. Governor Aziz mentioned that. When there's instability, we just live through that, when you have to go through extraordinary measures to keep deposits in the system. Vice versa, inclusion broadens the retail deposit base. And I think the empirical evidence is really coming together that says that increases the stability of the system. Interestingly enough, small deposits are far more sticky, so to speak. It's the large deposits that are withdrawn when there is a hint of crisis. That's the hot money.
That's
that
recognized
many of
in the Basel Standard, some of these issues about small deposits, right?
So I think there are these conceptual linkages, synergies that you would expect, and the empirical basis is panning out. But there are also concerns, a priori, if you will. And you can probably bucket them in two categories. Any inclusion effort that is focused on credit, expansion of credit, is bound to increase protection concerns, consumer protection concerns. And I think you all lived through that. And if there's a credit bubble that's too big and impedes the viability of institutions, that could also lead to stability concerns. And our case studies have examples of that. I could speak to that later. When the inclusion effort is on the deposit and payment system side, then the a priori concern is with respect to integrity. Right? Obviously, inclusion in this case helps inclusion itself. It increases the retail deposit base. That should help stability. We have that evidence, but there's the integrity concern. So that, I do think if you boil down the bigger picture and you take these pairwise correlations, there are some that are quite clear, positive, and then some where there are concerns. And that's the trade-off to be managed. And I can go in a few examples if that's helpful later.
Tom, that's already very helpful just to separate out the different domains of financial services with the different type of linkages that they bring. As you say, the credit side different from the payment side and its objectives. Well, let's just test you, the audience, on how much you see the same picture with a second question here. And while you vote, I'm going to ask my other colleagues to comment on it. So this question of trade-offs and the traditional framing of trade-offs, how do you see that? So these trade-offs, are they inevitable always? So in other words, if you say that, you're saying synergies are not possible. But you might still say they're usually there. Sometimes you might be able to synergize. That's number 3. You might say they're never trade-offs. It's possible to live in the green zone. Or it would be quite legitimate, as we've already heard this morning, given the state of the evidence base, to say, well, you're not yet quite sure, which is number 5. So please give us your votes. And as we do that, let me ask the Vice Governor from BCAO, how would you respond to that from BCAO's perspective about thinking about the existence of synergies and trade-offs?
Je pense que je voudrais rebondir sur l'intervention de Madame le gouverneur lorsqu'elle disait tout à l'heure que ça dépend du choix que l'on fait, l'objectif qu'on se détermine à suivre. Nous avons remarqué que si nous allons vers un objectif de stabilité, il va de soi que pour aller à l'inclusion, souvent il y a des synergies possibles, mais quelquefois aussi il y a des contraintes. L'exemple que je voudrais prendre va peut-être renforcer ce que disait le dernier intervenant tout à l'heure. Nous avons remarqué qu'au niveau de nos pays, vous savez que nous sommes une union monétaire et que nous avons 8 pays qui sont gérés par la Banque centrale du point de vue de la monnaie. Alors, il se trouve qu'il y a des disparités de ces pays-là. Et donc, par conséquent, on se rend compte que lorsqu'on veut réaliser une certaine politique, il y a lieu de tenir compte un peu de l'effet sur l'ensemble des pays, mais on est obligé de tenir compte aussi des cas par cas de certains pays peut-être moins avancés que d'autres. Ce que nous avons remarqué, c'est que pour arriver à la stabilité, nous avons créé par exemple un fonds de garantie des déposants. Ce fonds de garantie des déposants a pour objectif d'intervenir lorsque, en cas de crise, les plus gros déposants arrivent à se tirer d'affaire et que ne restent sur le plancher que ceux qui sont les plus démunis. En partant vers l'inclusion financière, cet objectif, qui est atteint par la création du dépôt, évidemment aussi, bien entendu, pose quelques petits problèmes. Il va de soi que dans certains pays qui sont les plus démunis, la constitution des dépôts doit aller jusqu'au village le plus reculé et les gens ne sont pas toujours aussi bien informés de leurs droits, même pour aller récupérer leurs ressources. Donc on est obligé quelquefois de faire des compromis et de faire ce qu'on appelle des compensations. Alors nous pensons que pour aller à la stabilité, nous pouvons donc considérer que le dépôt de garantie constitue une avancée, mais que dans une certaine mesure, il y a aussi des contraintes lorsque nous voulons faire exécuter certaines opérations ou en tout cas certaines réglementations par des pays qui ont une population pas très ouverte, pas très connaissante des choses. Nous voulons par exemple appliquer la lutte contre le blanchiment d'argent. Il va de soi que lorsque nous voulons une stabilité, c'est vrai que ça aide le système à être pérenne et durable. Mais dans le même temps, ça s'applique à des gens qui n'ont même pas, dans certains cas, de pièces d'identité, de cartes pour pouvoir indiquer dans quelle mesure même la manière dont ils se sont appropriés les ressources. Pour leur demander d'expliquer ça, c'est très difficile. Donc nous sommes obligés, dans notre réglementation, d'apporter des accommodements qui sont des moyens de, comment dirais-je, d'atteindre l'objectif et de stabilité et de protection, tout en faisant des compromis, parce que nous sommes obligés de réviser un peu la réglementation initiale. Bon, il va de soi également que dans certaines contrées comme les nôtres, nous avons eu, pour les normes de gestion ou les normes de protection des banques centrales, nous avons toujours respecté des normes qui sont venues de l'extérieur au moment où les préoccupations d'inclusion n'étaient pas encore à l'ordre du jour. Il se pose aujourd'hui la question de savoir, lorsque nous voulons aller à cette inclusion, est-ce que les règles sont encore applicables et applicables à nous? Il y a forcément des compromis à faire, parce qu'il est difficile. Madame la Majesté disait tout à l'heure que ça doit aller, les principes des directives doivent aller en même temps qu'on gère les différentes normes. On doit aller à la source pour pouvoir les inventer et pour pouvoir les appliquer. Il va de soi que, n'ayant pas été au moment où on créait ces normes de stabilité qui entourent les ratios de solvabilité et autres, leur application étendue à l'inclusion pose quelques problèmes et nous amène à faire des compromis. Voilà ce que je peux dire sur la matière pour l'instant.
Thank you, Vice Governor. So let's look at the result of the voting for a moment. So it sounds like the majority of you in the audience are in the zone that says it's possible. It's certainly not guaranteed, although some of you, 29 of you, believe that, as it were, always I'm sorry, when trade-offs are inevitable, you're saying always, sometimes, you're saying at least not all the time the trade-offs are there. You're open to the concept that you've heard from all the speakers this morning, which is that there can be these mutually reinforcive linkages. But we've heard all of them in different ways, wrestling with the pragmatic realities of the trade-offs that can sometimes exist. So a majority around doing that. Maybe the challenge we heard this morning, we heard from Bill Gates around paradigm changing, is perhaps saying, how do we move beyond simply thinking of trade-offs as the norm, synergies as possibly something that might strike from time to time, to actively making that work. And we've started to hear some examples here this morning. Governor Zeddy, you want to add to that?
I did want to add something that, because I highlighted about the trade-offs, and certainly since everyone has voted, and so I'm not influencing the votes, I would like to say that we fall in the category of sometimes. It's
You're
not,
a three as well.
there are many synergies, but there are trade-offs, and these trade-offs need to be managed. And we heard one example of how the trade-off can be managed, that is creating special funds. But there are others, and these include having advisory services. These are very, very useful, we have found, advisory services for those we want to bring in, even already in the financial system, counseling and financial education, and then having mechanisms that deal with problems like restructuring of debt, small debt, and resolution of financial institutions that provide such access for inclusive financial inclusion. So all these restructuring and resolution. So all these can assist in managing the trade-offs, because on the one side you have forbearance that you don't want to such forbearance because of wanting to pursue financial inclusion, then you contribute to financial instability or loss in confidence. So these are very important infrastructure to have that would assist managing trade-offs.
That's very helpful. And let's move on to now actively talk about that, because a number of suggestions have surfaced from our panelists this morning on this. So how do you do it? If those synergies exist, sometimes, possibly more often in some cases, how do you get to that point of optimizing? So let me ask Dr. Negrin, in Mexico, what are the insights from Mexico that might help us think about how to take advantage of the synergies when they exist?
Yeah, let me just start with the idea that the things go both ways. No, I mean, it's not. We've been discussing much of how financial inclusion affects integrity or how it affects stability, but really, one of the main contributions of central bank to financial inclusion is stability. I mean, now we are. Like in Mexico, we didn't have long-term contracts before because we had a very unstable situation inflation-wise. So in the last decade, 15, 20 years, we've developed a much more stable system, and that has allowed for a lot of more people to get into that. Now, regarding this idea of how you manage this and how you take advantage of these synergies, one of the things that in Mexico we're doing is it's like a coordination thing between different authorities. Our regulatory structure is such that the stability institution and the supervisory institution and the consumer protection are all separated. And so now we're all part of a financial inclusion council. And in there, we have a chance to coordinate inside to try to sort of take advantage of the possible synergies. The other thing that we are doing is collecting more information. A lot of the impacts and channels by means of which all these relationship happen are still not very well understood. There's a lot of evidence just growing right now. Randomized experiments on different places are providing you with a lot of evidence of what the influences may be. And so that's what we are doing.
And just to be clear, you as the Central Bank of Mexico, do you yourselves do some of the randomized experiments to collect that evidence, or do you leave it to others to do?
We do some of it. We're doing some of it regarding, for example, some of our obligations, transparency, for example. We want to see if people actually use information to take decisions. Very recently, we issued a regulation on ATMs by means of which clients get to see how much they're going to be charged before they perform a transaction. And we saw that people actually react a lot on the price. We used to think that people don't see what they have on their face, and they do. They actually have changed their pattern of consumption dramatically. So now that they know how much they get charged if they go to an ATM that doesn't belong to the same bank they have their account in, they have changed completely their pattern of consumption. So we do follow these sort of indicators.
Interesting. Tillman, you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, what might be helpful, so as part of of building a bit of an evidence base, we are trying to build a case library. And the study that a country that we're studying right now with a broader group of people is Pakistan. And they have done a number of things, and maybe somebody is here who can even speak later from State Bank, who can speak to it later. One journey that's interesting is the microfinance bank journey. It's a 13-year journey around the regulation of deposit-taking microfinance banks in Pakistan. And it started with the original ordinance in 2001. It included minimum capital requirements and a deposit protection fund for stability concerns. Over time, they increased the loan limits for this particular type of microfinance bank, so there was an inclusion adjustment being made. Ultimately, the State Bank allowed the first of these microfinance banks to actually join the bank clearinghouse to become sort of a full member of the fraternity, if you will. And I think that journey, and there's a similar journey on the branchless banking side, I think that journey illustrates a couple of things on the practical how-tos, if you will, on how to go about managing the trade-offs, as Governor Zetti said. They are sometimes there, and how do you manage them? So 4 or 5 thoughts. The first one is you have to have a champion probably within the regulatory or policy-making setup who said, this initiative we are driving on behalf of the system. The second is you have to a priori think about, in a framework, these trade-offs. If you address any initiative in a silo, you can't manage the trade-off. The third is then to a priori think through what are the linkages and assess their materiality. The fourth might be there is no such thing as ex-ante optimization. Optimization is almost by definition an iterative process, and I think many of you have done that. Professor Ndungu, your regulation with respect to branchless banking certainly had an iterative element to it. And then lastly, very importantly, industry engagement from the get-go, to get a sense, their help to assess what are the possible synergies and what are the possible trade-offs to get a really realistic understanding of that. So those are a couple of things that seem plausible and that come out of the case studies we are running.
That's really helpful. Let me ask Governor Rahman, this idea of a case library that Tillman mentions. Do you think that's a helpful thing for AFI to consider and for AFI members to consider building? Of examples, you gave us one today, but that might be analyzed to say, well, how did this happen that you optimized a linkage?
No. It's always better to have process documentation. I mean, as the process moves on, I think we should continue to, document this. And we do it from our side, but AFI has also been doing. In fact, AFI has gone to Bangladesh to document some of the success stories which we have done, in particularly this sharecropping, the loans which we have given to BRAC. AFI has brought out a briefing note also on that. So we regularly, in fact, collect this information and put it in our website. And our website, if you go through, is one of the most interactive websites. So that's how we do it. But on the trade-offs, let me come back to these issues which Dr. Zetti has focused. And from our side, I think we too believe that we need to manage the trade-offs. And how do we do it? In fact, we do it in a couple of manners, as she does it. Financial, literacy is one area where we are putting a lot of emphasis. Now the financial literacy is being promoted. We have started school banking, so that younger population starts thinking about financial programs right at the younger age. So the students of schools, we involve the teachers and the mothers, so that they become the joint account holders, mothers and the children, and they get all the ideas about financing. So that's something we are doing. One thing again, when we are giving loans, say for example agricultural loans, we ask the banks, all the banks, that whenever you provide loans to the agriculture farmers or the MFIs, put it in an open daylight, so that it's done in a transparent way. People know that who are the people who are receiving the loans. Secondly, just give me the cell number of that farmer, and all the cell number of the borrowers are deposited to the central bank, so that my office can randomize and talk to the farmers, and I do the same. Governors almost every month talks to a couple of farmers, so that whether they got the money or not. That gives a lot of pressure on the banks that you cannot get away by providing loans to somebody else, because I will be checking myself, sometime from time to time. So that's the data. Data always helps, in terms of taking that. Technology helps. Again, the partnership matters, because 1/3 of the agricultural loans really go through the partnership of the MFIs. And the MFIs really know their clients pretty well. They don't go for the conventional KYC. They know their first-hand knowledge about their borrowers, so they go through that, and that helps us bringing in lot of due diligence, not conventional, but this innovative due diligence. And again, we also take care of the AML, CFT concerns by really going through proportionate to perceived risk. Say for example, when we have given new circular for the mobile financial services about the size and the frequency of the limit. So there is a limit that where they really go, how many times a day they can really withdraw, how many times a month they can, what is the maximum limit there. So that's how we bring in the proportionate kind of risk management. And that has been working pretty well. I think the standard setting bodies need to also engage with these new types of financial inclusions, the behavioral changes which is taking place among the borrowers, among the ordinary citizens, need also to be taken into context while really dividing in standards. And I thought these are the positive kind of, as you say, the examples which we are giving, and the repository of the knowledge can be useful. In addition, we do one more thing for the customers. We in Central Bank in Bangladesh, like Bank Negara also, we have a customer interest protection center we have developed. And we have a hotline. You can know the hotline, 16236. If you just any borrower being not given the right service, she or he can immediately call 16236. 10 of my boys or girls are just sitting there. They will jump on that bank and really let know what is happening. And that's how, given last year I got 6,000 of the complaints, and we just solved it. That's how we take the consumer protection. It's okay.
That's a great example.
Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. So there we have across, in fact, all three examples here: rapid evidence gathering, randomized controlled trials, direct response, phone numbers, and this call to keep building the evidence base, because we are on a journey. And as we heard this morning, the journey is a long journey, and there's much evidence that has to be pulled together. So in a short moment, we'll give an opportunity for a few members of the audience to ask questions of the panel. But before we do that, I'd like to ask the Vice Governor. So, Vice Governor, we're hearing a number of common themes on this question of how do you do it. We're hearing about coordination. Governor Zeti spoke about that at the beginning. Others have echoed that in Mexico and so on. We've heard about a particular focus on end clients in Bangladesh, also in Malaysia. We've heard about cases and evidence collection. At BCAO, any insights you can give us on the how to, in a sense, how to do proportionality, that principle which we hear from standard setting bodies, but we have to grapple to implement at the country level?
Alors, c'est comme je le disais tantôt, la disparité de plusieurs pays nous amène à être très, très prudents dans l'approche. Et je crois que les honorables gouverneurs qui sont intervenus tout à l'heure ont plus ou moins insisté sur cette question. Dans cette matière, il est difficile de courir en se chaussant. C'est-à-dire, nous adoptons une nouvelle manière de faire, une inclusion qui n'était pas dans nos habitudes. Et il va de soi que lorsque nous voulons réaménager, il faut être sûr que nous n'allons pas vers une déstabilisation ou des contraintes particulières. Donc, la manière d'y arriver ne peut se faire que par le dialogue. Le dialogue, la concertation, en impliquant le plus grand nombre de personnes. Et c'est d'ailleurs ce que fait l'AFI. Lorsque l'AFI nous réunit, ceux qui s'occupent des normes, ceux qui s'occupent de la régulation, c'est dans cet esprit, je pense, qu'il faudrait aller, je crois, pour obtenir des résultats probants. Alors, la coordination chez nous également, nous avons la préoccupation d'obtenir qu'il y ait une transparence dans la réglementation, que ce soit porté à la connaissance du plus grand nombre de personnes, malgré le degré d'inaptitude d'une forte partie de la population qui ne connaît pas encore, qui n'est pas lettrée, qui n'est pas scolarisée. Donc c'est un grand défi. Il faudrait donc pouvoir obtenir des institutions que dans leur éducation à la masse, à l'éducation vers le consommateur, ce soit pris en compte et nous travaillons à cela. Nous travaillons également à obtenir des observatoires des services financiers dans tous les pays. Le Sénégal fait œuvre de leader dans ce domaine puisqu'il y a déjà un observatoire au Sénégal qui permet d'atteindre l'objectif que nous rappelait le gouverneur du Bangladesh tout à l'heure. Effectivement, lorsque des clients ont à se plaindre dans la zone du Sénégal, ils ont au moins un centre d'attache qui leur permet de pouvoir saisir la banque concernée via la banque centrale, par exemple. Alors, évidemment, quelqu'un a dit tout à l'heure qu'il faut un leader. La banque centrale peut ne pas être leader dans le système, mais il est important que la banque centrale soit coordonnatrice de cela. Parce que quelque part, nous nous sommes rendus compte que nous sommes au centre des préoccupations de stabilité, des préoccupations de protection des clients, des préoccupations aussi d'inclusion maintenant, puisque ça devient une autre charge qu'on nous impute. Et les pays ont tendance à nous donner de plus en plus de charges, compte tenu peut-être de l'efficacité qu'on semble donner. Alors, il va de soi que nous avons été obligés de créer des centres de coordination. Nous avons au niveau national ce que nous appelons les conseils nationaux du crédit, qui réunissent l'ensemble des opérateurs, consommateurs, ligue des consommateurs, des producteurs, du coton dans certains pays, d'arachide là où c'est, pour que chacun puisse avoir à dire son mot sur le fonctionnement et les relations de la clientèle avec leur banque là où ils sont. Donc ça permet effectivement de pouvoir avoir du bas vers le haut des informations qui permettent de mieux assurer notre régulation. Nous avons, au-delà, le comité de politique monétaire, comme dans toutes les banques centrales. Ce comité, évidemment, en fonction des personnes qui sont autour du gouverneur, permettent aussi d'avoir une certaine connaissance du terrain. Et enfin, nous avons un comité de stabilité financière qui est récemment créé suite à la crise qu'ont connue l'ensemble des pays. Ce comité de stabilité financière réunit l'ensemble des régulateurs de plusieurs domaines autres que monétaires. Nous avons la régulation du système des pensions sociales, le système des caisses de retraite, comme je le disais tout à l'heure, des postes de télécommunications, tout cela pour permettre d'avoir, puisque l'innovation tend à faire sortir du champ purement bancaire les différents services financiers, il est bon d'avoir ces différents acteurs autour de la scène pour travailler. Voilà un peu ce que nous essayons de faire pour mieux coordonner et tenir compte de leurs avis pour proportionner le risque que nous avons et donc donner une réglementation qui sied, qui tend vers l'inclusion sans remettre en cause la stabilité.
That's very helpful, Vice Governor. So this message of coordination and having formal mechanisms that make it work, such an important one. I don't want to lose your point about consultation, though, because it's very striking to us how we live in environments where we don't have all the information we would like at our fingertips to make policy. And so active, entrenched processes of consultation is something that certainly came through South Africa's ISIP case last year as being an important way of gathering more information through a structured process of engagement, not just across government agencies, but with the affected stakeholders, the public, as much as the providers involved. It's also interesting to me, as we turn to you, the audience, in just a moment, how many people here have mentioned this issue of consumer education as being so important to optimizing the linkages. And it seems to me there's an area where the word optimizing really has to be thought through, because so often more is not always better. You can do more and more and more consumer education. It doesn't necessarily make it effective. So if our concern is not just doing it or doing more of it, if our concern as AFI members is optimizing it, it raises some very interesting questions about, so what is the right balance of approaches? What really works? Is it roadshows, as we've heard, or call centers, and what other types of approaches? And I realize there'll be other panels and discussions that will pick up on that. So we're going to turn to you for questions. So let me see if, I guess by a show of hands, I'm not sure how the queuing system works here, but I see one hand and a couple of hands. We have time for probably one round of questions, and then we'll go to the panelists. So let me ask the Central Bank Governor from Kenya, Njuguna Ndung'u.
Just wanted to add a quick one on this financial inclusion, financial stability trade-off or synergy. But because virtually everyone will always say that financial stability is always going to be registered. But I think financial inclusion comes later because it's well defined in the development agenda. And like, for example, like in Kenya, we have Vision 2030. It says we want a financial structure, a financial system that does A, B, C, D. That's the time you start looking at your financial infrastructure and see, can it deliver what you are required? And that is now how we come back to say, look, you need financial instruments for you to complete the financial infrastructure, and for you to get that, you need financial institutions as well as initiatives to help you deliver that. Then you come up with the now new registration. Like for the last 10 years, we have microfinance institutions. We have strengthened the deposit insurance mechanisms. We have come up with credit reference bureaus. We have come up with programs for financial literacy and consumer protection. And you can see now, because of financial inclusion is being defined in the development agenda, then it goes back with its institutions and even registration to reinforce financial stability. And I think that is the continuum I wanted to add to. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. We had another hand there from Indonesia.
Thank you very much, sir. I would like to ask a question to Governor Zeti in this regard and the experience from Bangladesh about the branchless banking. First, about the branchless banking. I do realize that the introduction of branchless banking, especially in the remote and rural area, it will increase the competition between the bank or telco as the conductor of the branchless banking or mobile payment service, if I could say so, between among them and the microfinance institution. How to make a synergize between these all players with the aim to improve SMEs or unbanked people in the remote area or in the rural area? That's the first question. And the second question is whether this branchless banking or branchless banking also have activity as a bank to extend the loans to the SMEs, or they just only perform extended arm of the bank to gather the deposits from the people. And what do you think, whether we give all these activities, two activities, as gathering deposit and extending loans at the same time, or just only giving the authority to having deposits from the people? And the third thing, whether the product, continuing with the Governor Ndung'u, about the product of financial instrument for the SMEs or unbanked people, it has to be related with the no-frill account as a first, a no-frill account without any administrative cost, or whether they could choose based on the needs of the people. Thank you.
Thank you. Let us take a few more questions, and then I'll ask Governor Zeti to respond. There's another question there, please. And we have one behind.
I wanted to find out and add to the discussion about the trade-off between stability and inclusion. And I want to zero in on price stability. For countries that are still fighting high inflation, one would like to understand what research says so far about how monetary policy instruments that fight inflation become less or more effective as an area of trade-off. Another way of saying it is that central banks should have self-interest in the financial inclusion agenda, even if it's not driven by them, because arguably it does affect monetary aggregates in the form of either velocity of money or expansion of credit that then will affect how they do monetary policy. And this is an area where I would like to learn more.
Thank you. Let's take one more from the row behind there.
My name is Robert del Banco Central del Ecuador. La pregunta es para el gobernador de Bangladesh. Él mencionó que los corresponsales nos generan estabilidad. ¿A qué se refería con eso? ¿Corresponsales bancarios, no bancarios? Y también otra pregunta, dijo que mencionó que todas las subvenciones se hacían a través de las cuentas bancarias de la población. ¿Usted piensa que en estas subvenciones hay inclusión? En el momento que realizan los pagos a través de las cuentas bancarias, ¿existe inclusión? Básicamente esas dos.
Thank you. A specific question to Bangladesh. Let's address those questions. So, Governor Zeti, could I ask you first to respond to the questions, particularly about branchless banking in remote areas and your experience in Malaysia?
Yes. We've introduced two elements. One is through having agent banks, the agents of banks, and we have, I think, something like 4,000 of them now. We've just introduced it just over a year ago. And the function now is to accept deposits, but in the phase 2 of it is to extend financing as well. And then, of course, the other aspect of branchless banking is through mobile banking, and that is also gaining significant momentum. And of course, this does increase competition. But what we notice really that our banks, there are some that do participate in extending, for example, microfinancing, but not all banks engage in this. And therefore, we find that this is going to be complementary, but there will be, as it gains momentum, increased competition. We believe that this increased competition will precipitate greater financial inclusion, because even within our financial system, as we move in the late and early 2000s and late 1990s towards greater market orientation, we find that our banks become more, as a result of the increased competition, they become more efficient. And there's great motivation because we have been experiencing growth. And in an environment of growth, banking services and the profitability of the banking institution has always been significant. And therefore, they can have a role, and increased competition will just contribute to better services and pricing. Then I wanted to add on the question raised by the gentleman from Ecuador that because we have achieved success in having such a significant part of our population, the numbers actually indicate about 95% who have deposits. And therefore, now the government uses, like when we reduce subsidies and there are some payouts as a result of the savings the government gets from reducing subsidy, the payouts are to the low-income earners. And these payouts can be done through the banking system. It's credited to their account, and this is a very effective way to really function by giving subsidy rebates or special support to such poor income groups.
That's helpful. Thank you, Governor Zeti. Dr. Roman, do you want to answer as well the question about Bangladesh, and maybe also comment on the inflation question that came up about, as I understand it, the tools for fighting inflation, the traditional tools, and the effect on inclusion? And then after that, Dr. Green, you might like to join that discussion as well.
Let me start with the inflation, because this is the hardcore of the central banking. In Bangladesh, over the years, since we have intensified financial inclusion campaign, our inflation is coming down. It's falling regularly and consistently, mainly because of the participatory monetary policy stance which we have taken. Before we go for any monetary policy declaration, we really consult all the stakeholders, including think tanks, the chambers, even real entrepreneurs on the ground. So that gives us a feel about what is needed. And on a inflationary point of view, because financial inclusion really gives you a handle in terms of generating incremental output on a supply side. So, for example, on agriculture, since we are having higher product, so we don't have to really import rice, which is avoiding importing inflation. So from inside, you are increasing the capacity and the supply side intervention into your inflation. Secondly, because we are putting all the efforts in terms of technology and all that and bringing transparency, the money is going to the right sector. The money is not going to the pyramids, or money is not going to non-productive sector. One of the hallmark of Bangladesh monetary policy is that the money need to be redirected to small and medium enterprises. Over the last year alone, 29% increase in SME financing alone, and we have a strong database on the SMEs that where the money is going. We have online web-based database on SMEs, so the money is really going to the right people. So that gives you an extra productive sector, and that's helping us reducing our inflation. So inclusion has an impact on inflation as well. So that's given. Not on our issue on the branchless banking. We in Bangladesh, we really encourage, and this is our regulatory mandate, that we go for bank-led mobile financial services. All our mobile financial services are bank-led. We give license to the bank. Bank then can have a partnership with any of the other agents and other kinds of but the telcos can have telcos are motivated to build up the highways. They are not supposed to own the buses. So that's how we move ahead. And we bring them, and they are giving the USSD networks, and they are also doing a lot good business in terms of revenues. And on all the banks are having this partnership with the telcos in terms of providing this service, and this is doing well. On the agents, we have both bank agents and the non-bank agents. We have an advantage, as you said, in Bangladesh, because of the presence of licensed MFIs, which has as much as 17,000 of the branches around, they can act as our agent. And again, on the MFS itself, we have about 108,000 agents. These telco agents now can become your MFS agent. 50% of the mobile financial services now been taken care of by these agents. So it's a very interesting model which is emerging in Bangladesh, and Bill Gates and others are going for mapping, and the entire country is being mapped, and we can exactly know where are the access points, which are the areas where have financial inclusion has intensified, where it has not intensified. So we are taking an informed decision making out of that. But in Bangladesh, as I said, that the entire system is bank-led, transparent, and at the same time, I would say is pro poor. So that's how we have developed the system.
Thank you, Governor Ram.
Thank you.
Dr. Green, do you want to add anything briefly on the inflation?
Just very briefly
question?
on the inflation question. I still think that financial inclusion, it's useful. It generates benefits even on an inflationary context. Inflation is a very regressive tax. It affects mainly the poor. So providing them with instruments to even fight back in that context, it would bring benefits. But there are a number of services that wouldn't be easily provided. No, I mean, I'm thinking about credit, long-term credit, which is basic for poor households. Mm-hmm. And just one more comment on the no-frill accounts. I think that's a very good example of where the trade-offs are. Mm-hmm. When we introduced these non-frill accounts, we had a very bad reaction from the institutions, and the quality of the services suffered. So, we were worried about the institutions not having enough resources or not having incentives to provide these services. And what we ended up having was, accounts that have very restricted services. No, so it's a good example of the trade-offs, I think.
Interesting. Tom, would you like to add to that?
Maybe one quick reflection on Professor Ndungo's observation, if I understood it correctly, on where financial inclusion fits in with the other policy objective. I think it's important to keep in mind it really, really depends on the starting point of a country. Governor Assis reminded us that financial inclusion is conceivably now also a developed country issue, and that is true. The Europeans in particular are really concerned about financial exclusion. These used to be systems fully included with the crisis, unemployment, youth unemployment. There's a real concern about financial exclusion, almost more as a social exclusion phenomenon. That is very different from the other end of the spectrum, if you will. In some countries, the formal banking system reaches less than 20% of working age adults. Mm-hmm. And it essentially takes deposits from salaried employees and buys T-bills from governments. Mm-hmm. Frankly, in that setting, financial inclusion is financial systems development and deepening. It's a much bigger agenda.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tilman. We have about 10 minutes left of the panel. Alfred Hannig wanted to get in a question or comment quickly. Before I'm going to ask the panelists for their closing comments.
Yeah, mine is, first of all, let me just say that this is fantastic. And I think this is a great encouragement for many of the members to move forward with the good things they're already doing. It's wonderful, and it's great to see the passion. Let me also not forgo the opportunity, if you allow me, to encourage the panelists to share with us what did not work. Mm-hmm. We see a lot of, or even what have been the challenges along the way. I think this is extremely important for the members who are, in fact, struggling with many of these issues. Mm-hmm. And learning along the way, of course, means also to look at what was difficult. Mm-hmm. So apart from the fantastic success stories that we are hearing, I think it would be great to get an authentic picture of what was difficult. Thank you.
So let's use that question, and what I'm going to do, let me summarize what I think we've heard on this question of how do you think about optimizing. We've heard coordination matters. We've heard that information matters and the flow of information all the way through to the client, but also feedback loops to the governor or to the central bank policy-making mechanism really matter. We've heard consultation matters with all the different stakeholders involved. So we've heard that even the discussions around some of these examples where things have worked matters. Alfred now challenges us to say, well, what about examples where it doesn't work? So I'm going to ask each panelist in turn in our last 10 minutes just for a brief reflection on anything else we could do, and if you have an example of where it hasn't worked that leads us to some learning, please feel free to give that as well. So could I start with you, Vice Governor, on your side? Any other observations, how to, and perhaps any things you shouldn't do, things that don't work?
Merci. Je pense que pour ce qui concerne les échecs, évidemment, lorsqu'on agit, on a toujours des domaines qu'on ne maîtrise pas beaucoup. Et donc, les outils aussi dépendent de l'information que l'on peut avoir pour pouvoir faire des règles et pouvoir suivre. Et donc, il se trouve que l'information est un élément qui a été notre souci et qui demeure notre souci jusqu'à présent. Quand il s'agit déjà d'envisager même l'évaluation de l'impact de notre action, cela aussi se pose un problème d'information. Il va de soi que nous aurons beaucoup à faire pour, en tout cas, traiter ce problème de manière très conséquente. Je dois dire également que pour ce qui concerne les expériences, nous avions tenté, avant cette période-ci de réforme, de soutenir certaines activités allant vers les secteurs sociaux ou les secteurs de PME en insistant sur le taux d'intérêt. Ça nous a amené beaucoup de problèmes. Donc nous avons essayé d'être moins entreprenants parce qu'il y a des mesures d'accompagnement nécessaires. Et ces mesures d'accompagnement nous amènent à nous poser la question, est-ce que dans cette nouvelle façon de procéder, pour aller vers l'inclusion, il faut que d'autres parties aussi jouent leur rôle. Les États aussi devraient jouer leur rôle pour créer l'interface qui permet d'avoir les instruments de les accompagner, qui permet d'avoir les outils pour les accompagner et les travaux de base sur des statistiques, sur les réceptacles, l'organisation du monde paysan, l'organisation des travailleurs. Tout cela, ce sont des domaines sur lesquels il me semble que les banques centrales ne sont pas compétentes. Et il faudrait que d'autres personnes puissent prendre le relais et travailler pour que nous puissions avoir les moyens donc, de pouvoir donner le plein appui de notre part. Nous avons également relevé que, et ceci pour terminer, que lorsque nous visons les objectifs d'inclusion, nous avons voulu amener les banques à se positionner dans un domaine qui n'est pas le leur, dans le domaine des villages, des endroits les plus reculés. Il y a des coûts à prendre en charge. Quelqu'un doit payer cela. Sinon, les comptes zéro sont là pour montrer qu'il y a quelques réticences et il faudrait qu'on regarde comment on peut prendre cela en charge. Et en définitive, même si on leur donne la possibilité de recueillir des dépôts, il n'est pas sûr que l'inclusion puisse suivre automatiquement. Parce que ces dépôts peuvent être transférés vers le niveau central des villes, où il y a peut-être moins de risques à prêter, moins de problèmes, et on peut manquer l'inclusion en redonnant, là où les dépôts sont précomptés, la chance aux petites entreprises qui y sont et qui doivent aussi bénéficier de ces procédures d'inclusion. Donc, me semble-t-il, c'est une observation de tout temps, c'est un travail de longue haleine et d'un suivi permanent et de prudence qu'il conviendrait peut-être de retenir.
Thank you, Vice Governor. So, Governor Zeti, your closing thoughts and maybe your response to the challenge.
Yes. Well, first to the challenge, what did not work? Yes, along the way, it was by trial and error, some of these work that we have done to advance the financial inclusion. And one of them, for example, is when the populist approach to this is having the lowest costs, it was thought, of such financial services to those that do not have access to financial services. And somehow this is not going to be sustainable. We already can see, like when programs where too much subsidies is given, now the fiscal position of governments cannot withstand this financial burden. And therefore, we saw two programs that were introduced did not succeed because of this. And when we reintroduced the program where it was more reflective of the costs associated with the program, these programs now are highly successful. So we did go through that process. In conclusion, I'd just like to say, after listening also to all the other panel members and also from the questions raised, what is key is that no agency can do this, advance the financial inclusion agenda on their own, in a silo, as what was mentioned. And this needs to be greater engagement, greater consultation, dialogue, and so on. It needs to be across agencies and ministries. But of course, if you have a leadership, a champion, that certainly will help push the agenda forward. And also with the industry, because they are the ones that are the channels through which this can be achieved. And within the central bank as well, we need to work across the departments, from the supervision to the macroeconomists to the financial markets, because there's synergy in the information. The second point is information matters. It forms a basis for decision, and we don't have enough information, and this is what needs to be done. I think the panelists we have heard also has mentioned this. And the final point that has not really been mentioned extensively is the capacity building. Because to do this, the industry needs to be positioned to be able to do it. Therefore, the talent development, the knowledge, and so on, they need this, and even in the central bank. So we believe capacity building is so important for execution of the ideas and thinking and systems that we know must be put in place to advance forward. But do we have the people who know how to do it? And therefore, we focus now quite a lot of attention, not only at the central bank for this knowledge sharing and capacity building, but also for the industry and in learning and education, so that they can effectively take it forward.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So, Governor Rahman, your closing thoughts.
No, I think Dr. Jetty has helped me in terms of covering many of the grounds which I was thinking, but I fully agree with her, some of the comments she made. But let me add that if you tell me what is the biggest challenge, I would tell you is the mindset. You can take the cows near to the river, but you cannot force the cow to have drink the water. So the main challenge which I faced, initially, the industry, initially didn't have a clue how to handle this financial inclusion. They thought this is a fancy idea of the governor, or it need not be taken that seriously. But then when I really explain to them that these are the advantages of the financial inclusion, and you too can do a win-win situation. It's a good business. I said it's a good business to the CEOs, because the other day one of the CEOs came to me. He said that in my SME loans, my NPL, non-performing loan, is only 0.02%. While on the large borrowers, the percentage is in double digits. So I thought you gave me a very good advice that we go for the small, and we are benefiting out of it. So that's the mindset, I think, is the biggest challenge. If you can get that challenge, and if you can face them, and again, you'll have to not only cook the cake, you'll have to eat it yourself. I think the governor, as a governor, you'll be maybe I'm telling this, I should not have done. I have been into the villages as many as 100 times over the last 4 years, talk to the farmers, talk to the SMEs, talk to the women entrepreneurs myself to know their the barriers, where the finance, the barriers. So, and then when I moved, the CEOs moved, the other central bankers moved, and now they are moving almost every day to their areas. So that's how you need to know them firsthand, and a first-hand knowledge is always useful. And I thought that's one challenge we need to come out. Secondly, I think the participation of the development partners is also very important. Here the development partners were still skeptical about the small kind of loans, but then we encouraged JICA, ADB to move into small and medium enterprises, and I gave a conditionality there. I said, if you've come in for SMEs, you'll have to agree to the central bank's proposition that at least 15% of the refinanced money you are providing must go to the women entrepreneurs first, then the others can come in. And they all agreed, and that's how we are now bringing them into that. But finally, what I would say, we need to really focus on socially responsible financing, as Dr. Zeti just mentioned. She didn't elaborate. And we in Bangladesh, we have now a separate department called Green Banking and Corporate Social Responsibility Department in the central bank. And they really make sure that all the banks have a plan that this year they will make so much of the socially responsible financing, both in agriculture, SME, in addition to the market failures, responding to the market failures. So banks are now are advised to tell the central bank that this year they will put in so many scholarships for the remote villages and also the disadvantaged students. Of this, 1/3 has to go just for the for the women who are really not getting the scholarships, or again 1/3 of the entire CSR fund must go for the education. So these kind of things we are putting, and every year we are getting them on the website that which bank is doing what. The first 10 banks who have done better in socially responsible financing, so we put them on the on the website and encourage them to go further next year. So that's how we are bringing this socially responsible financing as a core theme, and financial inclusion is a part of that. So that's how you change the mindset, and I think that's the biggest challenge, and we are facing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor Rahman. Dr. Nagreen, your closing thoughts briefly?
Yeah, just a couple of cases, a couple of points. One of them is that our role as central bankers is kind of changing. We now are turning into some sort of financial generalists where we need to know things about consumer protection, about other things that we didn't used to do. That's I think an important change in the mindset. The other thing is that this is an issue that brings together micro and macroeconomics in a very nice way. Like we would like to have stable households, which translate into stable financial institutions, which translate into a stable financial system. And this is something that is not always very clear. We in Mexico have a relatively stable economy. We've had it for a long time, and still that does not necessarily reflect in the households. Mm-hmm. And so this is one way in which we need to work. And the last comment is on the idea of bringing the industry on board. In many of these issues, we need to make a better business case. It just seems to me that we have a social mindset trying to solve a problem that it's good and we all want it, but we need to make a better business case.
Incentives matter. Thank you. Tomo, last comment from you.
At the global level, while a lot of progress has been made, at the global level, I think it's fair to say at the end of the day, in the architecture of institution and standard-setting bodies, each of them still has a core mandate. And so some of the dialogue we are having here is not really happening at the global level. Some progress has been made. Your Majesty, Queen Maxima, was very instrumental bringing together the big standard-setting bodies, inviting them jointly with the chairman of the Basel Committee. That has happened twice. The G20 has led some efforts, but it's still a bit ad hoc. So I think the notion of AFI's push to say, let's use these mechanisms to have a broader dialogue, that seems really important to me. And also making sure that the countries who are having representatives on these different standard-setting bodies actually do speak with one voice. Because if you talk to the secretariats, they would say, while we are very sympathetic, sometimes the countries do not speak with one voice, and that would, of course, help. So I think a lot of progress has been made, but we can probably do more as a community.
Norman, thank you. And thank you all. I think we've had a rich discussion this morning, and as you've heard on this long road which AFI is on in looking at these linkages, this is not the end, it's only the beginning. But I think we've heard two things about how to do this better. The one is this morning, in terms of the mindset that Dr. Rahman and others have spoken of, as AFI members, as a community, the mindset is at least saying, Trade-offs are not inevitable in this space, and synergies are possible. That's what your voting said and what you heard from the panelists on the stage this morning. And then in terms of this difficult question of how do you do it, what we've heard is a range of central banks grappling with first identifying what those linkages are, without which you can't then manage them as many are doing through all these different mechanisms of coordination and consultation and information flow and so on. And with the hope that now we're getting into the space of thinking about optimization, this incremental process of going back and changing policies in the light of new evidence so that they can achieve more on that road, because there are no easy solutions. It's a long road, but it's a possible road, and that, I think, is the message of the panel this morning. So please join me in thanking the panelists for their participation.